Greetings, Internet, and welcome to our little nook of the podcast world. You're listening to G-Score, a symphonic history of the Godzilla series. Hey, Jonathan.
Hey, Evan.
Greetings, listeners. Thank you for joining us for the first episode of G-Score. As the title implies, Jonathan and I are going to take an in-depth look at the Godzilla series, but through the lens of the musical scores which accompany the movies.
So, sit back, folks, and enjoy the ride.
Of course, as you might imagine, this is a topic that would be particularly of interest to Godzilla fans, or fans of Japanese monster movies in general. However, we want this podcast to have a broader range, because the music in these films is not just for Godzilla fans. It's really, really good music, and we want to share it with everyone. If you enjoy classical music or symphonic music, like movie soundtracks, video game soundtracks, you're probably going to find something to enjoy here. Because in 65 years, there's been a ton of phenomenal music that has been written, and we are excited to bring it to you with the context of each movie. So to begin our exploration into the Godzilla series, we should start where it all began. So Jonathan, where did it all begin?
Well, it all started with the atomic bomb. Early in the morning on March 1st, 1954, the U.S. detonated a 15-megaton H-bomb, and a not-so-lucky wooden Japanese trawler by the name of Lucky Dragon 5 became showered in this white, sticky radioactive ash from the blast.
I think that was actually the Castle Bravo test, wasn't it, at Bikini Atoll?
Yes, it was. And you can imagine the tension and anger that the Japanese felt as if they were reliving those events again after the bombing.
Right, because it wasn't even a full decade since they had experienced a nuclear attack.
No, the wounds were still fresh. They had to still deal with that. So, during that same time period, a producer with the Toho Motion Picture Corporation by the name of Tomoyuki Tanaka was flying home from Jakarta, where plans for a Japanese and Indonesian film had fallen apart. The film was supposed to be one of Toho's major releases that year. Tanaka was under such pressure to come up with a replacement for the film, but thankfully, during his flight back, he had this thought, this idea.
Eureka!
He thought, yes, exactly. And so he thought of the American film The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms.
As anyone
which
would.
Is yes. A film about a dinosaur who is resurrected by atomic tests in the Arctic and swims south to terrorize New York.
I'm sensing plagiarism.
I am sensing too. We have to talk to Tanaka about that, so...
There's a fine line between plagiarism and inspiration.
Still. But it did become the seed for Gojira.
Gojira, of course, being the Japanese pronunciation, which is transliterated as Godzilla in English. And just so you know, the name Godzilla has nothing to do with God. You're just pronouncing it wrong. We all are. If we were going to pronounce it correctly, it'd be said Godzilla in English, but we take the D and move it over to the first syllable and turn it into Godzilla. So, that's our fault. We're lazy. We anglicized it as we do with everything. Nice,
yeah, pretty much.
There. Yeah. So to bring Gojira to life, Tanaka turned to a crew of very talented individuals, one of whom was Ishiro Honda, a film director who was best known for his documentaries and drama pieces at that time, and a World War II veteran who had actually been a prisoner of war in China and had passed through Nagasaki after it had been flattened by the atomic bomb.
Wow, so he saw that firsthand.
He did. And in fact, it directly influenced his take on Godzilla. Rather than just making another monster on the loose film like The Beast or King Kong had been, Honda wanted Godzilla to be a more serious, grounded, and metaphorical film. To quote Honda,
Godzilla was made by hydrogen bombs, even more powerful than those atomic bombs. Nothing, no weapon can beat Godzilla. The science of man never produces only happiness. It also produces the antithesis, like Godzilla. So I used that as my basis for directing Godzilla. Most of the visual images I got were from my war experiences. After the war, all of Japan, as well as Tokyo, was left in ashes. The atomic bomb had emerged and completely destroyed Hiroshima. If Godzilla had been just a big ancient dinosaur or some other animal, he would have been killed by just one cannonball. But if he were equal to an atomic bomb, man wouldn't know what to do. So I took the characteristics of an atomic bomb and applied them to Godzilla.
And that is where Godzilla stands in stark contrast with so many other monsters of this time period. For instance, the 1950s B-movie giant monster science fiction craze that was engulfing the United States and much of Europe as well often used the atomic bomb or radiation simply as a gimmick. How are we going to get a giant tarantula or big ants? Well, just expose them to radiation. Or how are we going to get a dinosaur to ravage Los Angeles? Wake it up with an atomic bomb. But Godzilla was different. Yes, he was awoken by the atomic bomb. Yes, he was radiated by the atomic bomb, but he was also a stand-in for the atomic bomb. Godzilla,
He was a walking weapon.
he was a walking bomb, exactly. And that even influenced the design of Godzilla. For example, the rugged skin texture that they sculpted him with was specifically modeled after the keloid scars of the burn victims from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Or the very fact that he breathes fire was done for the sole purpose of giving a visual representation to the destructive power of radiation. And so Godzilla was given his famous atomic breath, which in this film is depicted as a white-hot, concentrated spray of radioactivity that's able to melt or combust anything that it touches. And of course, like the atomic bomb, Godzilla is indestructible. The atomic bomb can destroy anything. Nothing can destroy it. You're going to send tanks after a nuke? Just detonate the nuke and all of your tanks are gone. Same with Godzilla. That's why conventional weapons are proven to be absolutely useless against him.
Right. That's why other typical monsters are taken out by typical like planes and tanks and so forth. But none of that works with him. None of that. He just keeps moving along like a force of nature, like a gigantic hurricane.
There was another phenomenal talent that was brought onto the crew, a fellow named Eiji Tsuburaya.
So Tsuburaya was the man who handled the special effects on the film. Tsuburaya was considered one of the greatest masters of miniature effects. In fact, one of his earlier World War II works, which was the recreation on the attack of Pearl Harbor, was actually mistaken for actual war footage and even became blacklisted. Isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, he was purged from being able to work again, which is ironically how he ended up meeting Ifukube. Ifukube had a friend who was an actor that would often have sake with Ifukube, who, by the way, is the composer we're going to be discussing in a moment. And the Tsuburaya was a friend of that actor. So whenever Tsuburaya would meet up with this actor and Ifukube, the actor would give Tsuburaya some sake because he knew that he had no money. He was out of work. So whenever Ifukube later on would meet up with Tsuburaya, he too would always give him sake. And Tsuburaya remembered this because Tsuburaya was extremely protective of his rushes. When he would film special effects scenes, he wouldn't even let the director of the movie, in this case including Ishiro Honda, see the rushes before they were completed. But he would let Ifukube always look at the rushes, so that way he would have something to write music to, because he felt indebted to him for the hospitality that he had shown him.
Wow, that's a great honor.
It is. So never hold back free sake from somebody. You never know how it might repay you in the future. And because Tsuburaya actually permitted Ifukube to see those rushes, Ifukube was able to use them in private screenings with his orchestra. He noticed that even though he was trying to write very primal, very raw and earthy music, when he would give the music to the musicians in the orchestra, they would play too sophisticatedly. It was their nature. He didn't want them playing like they were going to be in a concert hall. He wanted them to play more aggressive. And so he would show them the rushes of Godzilla destroying Tokyo while they were actually making the performance. The musicians actually started playing more aggressive and more monstrous in their music, which is exactly what Ifukube wanted. And I think that's a super clever idea. I would actually love to experiment with that sometime. You know, get an orchestra to play the Godzilla music, an orchestra that has never seen a Godzilla movie before, to play the music from the film, and then show them the film as they're playing it and see if it doesn't change the way they play. That'd be very cool to see. But Tsuburaya was a phenomenal special effects director. He wanted to use stop motion animation, which was what brought the original King Kong to life in 1933, and he himself loved King Kong very much. But he estimated that it would take him 7 years to do all of the special effects footage through stop motion animation.
Oh no, that's a no-go.
Yeah, for real. And they only had about 5 or 6 months. So he invented a technique called suitmation, which is the ingenious idea of putting a man into a monster suit.
Revolutionary.
Yeah, absolutely revolutionary. And that had never been done in Japan before. The suit was made out of rubber latex. It weighed 250 pounds, and it was so stiff the actor inside, in this case, stuntman Haruo Nakajima, could barely move, breathe, see, or hear. Never mind that he was under extreme heat from the suit and the studio lights. He often would end up passing out when he was filming these scenes, and could only stand to be in the suit for a few moments at a time.
And that he was adept at martial arts too and other sports, so he was chosen actually for his strength and endurance. So even then, he would pass out and be suffering in that suit.
He would. It was grueling, but the effect is undeniably impressive. Godzilla is brought to life with a kinetic energy that you can just feel. It is visceral. Godzilla moves and breathes like an actual monster, like an actual animal.
Yeah, like there are moments that when you see him coming through and just coming in, it even holds up to today. A lot of parts of it still hold up.
And we mentioned the Akira Ifukube, the composer. Now let's get into talking about him, because for the purpose of this episode, he is the central figure of what we want to discuss. Akira Ifukube was one of the most renowned Japanese composers in the country. You can almost think of him as Japan's equivalent of our John Williams. But whereas John Williams is predominantly known for his film scores, Ifukube was first and foremost a classical musician. His preferred home was in the concert hall.
It's an interesting quote from Ifukube that he said,
"Some friends in the industry warned me against it. The film was considered trash at the time, just as it was deemed career suicide for an actress to star in a ghost film. People said working on a monster film would end my career and advised me to back out. But I felt it was a serious film. I refused to listen and proceeded to work on it."
And this clearly did not dampen Ifukube's resolve to write the music for this film. When he got the script, he was genuinely enthusiastic about this. As he once said, "I'm a simple country boy. I get excited when I see big things." But it went beyond that. After reading the script, he once remarked,
"Something monstrous comes out and makes you jump out of your wits. It is sheer fear, and not an abstraction, and it's global. Moreover, my specialty was biology. I couldn't sit still when I heard that in this movie the main character was a reptile that would be rampaging through the city." When I read the scenario, I intuitively felt the philosophy of anti-technology. After we lost the war, I was more shocked by the technology and science imported from America more than I was dissatisfied with the shortage of food. I had a strong impression that we had been defeated by American science and technology. I had an inferiority complex about the highly advanced scientific weapons in the United States, but the airplane, the jet plane, the electricity were all no use for the monster. He pulled down the high-voltage poles. Nothing can beat him. I felt so good. I felt the film suggested anti-civilization and the limit of today's technology.
Ifukube was born in Hokkaido, which is Japan's northern island, in a small village there. Yep, his father was the mayor. It was a village that had a large Ainu population. Now, for those of you who don't know, you can think of the Ainu as being like Japan's equivalent of Native American Indians. What was it that Ifukube has said about his early childhood?
This is straight from the horse's mouth. He said,
"I began my music career as a performer in the student orchestra at school. Then, while I was in college, I became a concert master. I performed many European classical pieces, but I really liked only Igor Stravinsky's and Manuel de Falla's music. That was because their music was very different. It is what made me decide to become a composer. I got an electric shock when I listened to The Rite of Spring and Petrushka. I felt that Stravinsky's musical vision was not European, but close to ours. My afterthought was that this was because of the aesthetic sympathy coming from the shared blood. Stravinsky appealed to me directly. I felt sympathy because I already had it. Rather than receiving inspiration from him, I found him doing exactly what I wanted. Stravinsky let me know an alternative form of European music. The Ainu, with their improvisational style of both composing music and dancing, greatly influenced me. I became very different from the other music students who had been raised with European pieces because of this. They had been taught that composition is very difficult, but to me, it seemed relatively easy because of the freedom allowed for by the improvisational style of the Ainu.
And in fact, that style of the Ainu helped to give Ifukube his distinctive trademark sound. He once mentioned that, and I quote, "The music of the Ainu people was ostinato." Now, ostinato is a musical phrase that means the continuous repetition of small sections or phrases of music.
And his master was against that method, wasn't he?
Oh, he was, yeah. He had a famous Russian tutor,
Alexander Chidapnyan. He actually told Ifukube to avoid the ostinato technique in music because of its repetitive nature.
Ifukube, as he's just about to tell us, doubled down on going against that advice.
The music of the Ainu people was ostinato, so perhaps this is the manner by which I was affected by the music of the Ainu. When you think of Japanese music, for example, the whole of Sado Okesa, Japanese folk music, the whole rhythm, no matter how much the melody changes, that rhythm never changes. It just keeps going. Because there is a lot of ostinato music in Japan, I purposely use a lot more than other Japanese composers.
And it shows, especially in the movies. And to be fair, if you take one of Ifukube's movie soundtracks and you just pop in the CD and you listen to it as a standalone experience, some of them can tend to grind on your nerves because you hear the same melody or the same track seemingly being repeated over and over and over again throughout the score without much variation. And that, in part, is because the man really didn't have a lot of time to write original music.
Only a week, right?
Yeah. And this was common in Japan. They turned movies out like a production line in a factory. Composers only had about a week or less to write, record, edit, and dub all of the music for a film. To put that in context, a modern composer today might have an average of about several weeks or even 3 months to do the music for a movie, which by that standard, a modern Hollywood composer might only be able to do realistically 4 films a year. Ifukube was doing 12 films a year. So that was, so he's working under a lot of pressure, and it didn't allow for him to be as creative as he would like to be, or as original, I should say, as he would have liked to have been. But Ifukube was even surprised that anyone would want to hear his music outside the context of the movie, because when you watch a movie, you're not always consciously listening to the music, so you wouldn't always be aware of how much you're really hearing the same melodies over and over and over again, because you're focusing on the visuals. But of course, it's a different story when you're just listening to the CD, and that's why Ifukube thought, why would you ever listen to the music outside of the movie? It was there just to support the movie. It wasn't a concert piece that I had written, and Ifukube had written a lot of concert pieces. He was a classical composer first and foremost. Well, and that's because of Ifukube's personal philosophy on how to score a film. He once mentioned in an interview,
music should suggest locations and periods. It can excite feelings and moods. Using point and or counterpoint, it is effective in creating rhythm or indicating sequence, continuity over several scenes, or as a bridge, and it can embellish the photography. Something in drama just can't coexist with music. When music starts to create its own world, the visual and dramatic portions get pushed aside. I feel that music should have its own microcosm. The perfect sound has no room for visual and dramatic phrases. I do not like any scene where drama, color, and music are all perfectly balanced. A scene can be just beautiful, dramatic, or full of music, but it should not be a mixture of all. A musical can be weak dramatically. An opera can have a simple story. The life of a movie is in its camera work and drama. Music is only to support them. That's how I feel.
No, I could definitely see his way of thinking, especially throughout the movie. It's never overcrowded or oversaturated. It definitely elevates the moments when Gojira or the army are present, and really, just it's there as a support system. It's not to completely drench and take over. It just heightens the emotions and the feelings in the moment. So it's rather interesting how in this film of Gojira, the actual music, the soundtrack isn't really that long. In fact, there's many moments where there's actually pure silence. Even the first appearance where you see Godzilla over the hill, there's no music in the background. There's no cymbals clashing or some kind of grand crescendo, nothing like that. It's just the beast in its purest form. And even when he's walking around through Tokyo, there are many scenes that he's just plowing through. The flames are lit in the background and there's just no sound, but it's so effective because I feel it really puts you in the moment, because of course in real life there's no music there, but it adds an eeriness and almost unsettling quality to it when there isn't music. And when the music is in there, it's in very pivotal moments, and it's less is more in this case. And I think it was very effective what Ifukube did with this movie in that case, and then very distinct as well.
Ifukube's music is very straightforward.
Yeah.
It doesn't pretend to be anything. It doesn't try to be overly complicated. It can seem very minimalist and raw at times.
But it's effective.
Oh, it's extremely effective. Now, of course, if Ifukube had perfect conditions, he would love to have months to write a score and to have as big of an orchestra as he would like, but he didn't. He only had a week at most to put together everything, and he only had a very small orchestra to work with. And that's because, going back to the silent era of Japanese film industry, you would have a live orchestra perform inside of a pit at a theater house. And so when movies started featuring sound, film studios figured, well, what worked for silent movies for a score would work just as well for talkies, as they're called. And so they were often constricted. Even the recording studio was physically tiny and could only fit so many people. But even so, Ifukube, especially for this film, really pushed the envelope to try and get as many musicians in there as possible. Ifukube once said,
"When I write music, I start my outline using string instruments. Then I use brass, percussion, and piano to their fullest. I like a good foundation with contrabass in it. I like low sound. When recording for movies, the studio limits the number of musicians. My typical numbers are 8 first violins, 6 second violins, 4 violas, 3 cellos, and 2 contrabass."
And because he had those physical limitations, Ifukube, as he mentioned, would often write on lower registers, because when music sounds deeper and darker, it often sounds bigger too. It hides the size of the orchestra.
Ah, clever.
Very clever. And actually, I have heard other composers who worked with similar constraints but did not understand orchestration as well as Ifukube did. And you can hear, because they're writing the music as if it should be a full orchestra, but it's not. And you can hear the smallness of the orchestra. Ifukube would have transposed all that music to being on the lower scales, lower registers, in order to hide just how few instruments he really had.
That's Sly-kun.
I know, right? Ifukube also said regarding the scoring of monster movies that he would always use 3 primary motifs. And you're going to hear the truthfulness of this statement throughout the podcast as we go from one Ifukube score to another. He always had a motif or theme for the monster, for the military, and a requiem. Ifukube said,
"The monster is a thing with volume, and they are very big, so you can only use instruments with lower tones, such as a piano. You cannot change the tone, so the only thing you can change is the quality and type of sound. Then there is the next type of music, the march. This was music just for the Japanese military, like when a tank was moving. Then there are the sad scenes where I had to use the requiem. It is very simple, but that is the pattern of all monster movies. The monster attacks, people in the city suffer damage and tragedy, the army sets off. So I made these 3 types of music for these scenes.
And Honda appreciated the power that music could have in bringing to life something like Godzilla. Ifukube once said, quote,
Honda felt the music was an essential element to bringing Godzilla to life. He felt that if the music were strong enough, Godzilla would become more believable and scary. The music was part of the special effects, so to speak.
And Honda admitted to Ifukube that he didn't have much background in music, though I think he probably had more background than he let on.
Yeah.
But he gave Ifukube his space to work and said, okay, this is your field of expertise. I trust you to do what needs to be done. And so he gave Ifukube a lot of creative freedom.
Oh, smart idea.
In fact, Honda himself said of Ifukube,
From our first meeting together, I already sensed what an amazing musician he was. He asked us what certain special sound effects we were going to use in certain parts of the movie, and about all kinds of details concerning sound.
and Ifukube was particularly curious about this because he himself had experience in sound design, even going back to World War II. And that's a fact that did not go unnoticed by Toho. When Toho's sound engineers were trying to create a roar for the monster, they tried everything. They went to the zoo and recorded animal sound effects of all sorts, birds and lions and monkeys and elephants. They played that stuff backwards and forwards at fast speed, at slow speed. They mixed them together. They just couldn't get
Nothing.
They couldn't get anything that sounded right. But they went to Ifukube and said, please help us. And Ifukube...
Our Lord and Savior. So, at first, it was like Ifukube was kind of dubious that Godzilla should make any sound at all. He was well aware of the fact that reptiles don't have any vocal cords and can't make any sounds, and definitely not roars. Ifukube wasn't sure that giving Godzilla a voice would make scientific sense, really. Actually, the director Honda, he was kind of sometimes almost bemused by Ifukube's literal take on an issue, though he wanted his monster to have the ability to give these kind of terrifying screams, and even explain to Ifukube that Godzilla was kind of a mutation due to the exposure of the hydrogen bomb. Even Honda's reasoning was apparently pretty convincing, and so Ifukube began to think about how like a sound of that nature could be produced. He came in and he had these leather gloves that he would rub against the loosened strings of his double bass.
They were,
and so
the gloves were coated in
resin.
Resin,
Yeah,
thank you.
and so and so by rubbing it against it, it created this roar-like effect. And he did it multiple times, which is such a clever and unique way to make a sound, especially for a monster. You know, it would make sense to try and use animal sounds at first, because, you know, they're beastly sounding, but this proved to be more effective and unique, because Godzilla's roar is one of the most unique sounds in cinema history. Even some people who are not familiar with Godzilla or the movies, if they hear the roar, they can usually tell that is Godzilla. It's almost akin to as famous as the T-Rex roar, you know, from Jurassic Park.
I would say it's even far more famous than the Tyrannosaur roar in Jurassic Park. So Godzilla's roar is actually music. It's a musical instrument. There's actually a fellow on YouTube who, back in 2014, I think it was, tried to recreate this. He made a video. Maybe you can search it if you look for it. And he doesn't do the technique exactly as Ifukube did, but even so, the end result, without any sound manipulation, because they did manipulate the recording after they rubbed the gloves on the cello, even without any sound manipulation, it does bear a striking resemblance to Godzilla's roar.
That's incredible.
That wasn't the only sound effect Ifukube created.
What else did he do?
Oh, well, let me tell you. He did Godzilla's footfalls.
Really? How's that?
He said that it was a device that was just a box that had several coils connected to an amplifier and a speaker in it. To quote,
"When you struck it, the coils would vibrate, and a loud, shocking sound would be created. I accidentally stepped on the device when I was conducting the score for a movie that was produced shortly before Gojira was made. I said, 'What the heck is that?' When I heard the noise that was produced, when I was asked to create Godzilla's footfalls, I decided to use the device."
It's amazing because the footfalls had such an eerie effect. It's almost like drums slowly coming, like a death march, almost like your death is coming. The end is near.
And that brings us to the music of the film. The most notable cue, without a doubt, in this entire soundtrack is the main title, which has that famous three-note descending phrase, dun 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 dun. And that is not totally original to this movie. In fact, Ifukube had used that phrase a few times before in previous movies, though not to any notable worth. But its true origin goes all the way back to a violin concerto that Ifukube wrote in 1947. The first movement of the concerto, about halfway through, you hear the dun 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 very distinctly, though it isn't elaborated on and it's not fully developed as you're going to hear it in this film. And though this melody has come to represent the franchise as a whole, and in particular Godzilla himself, it did not start off as the theme of Godzilla in this movie. It was actually the theme for the Japanese military, or you could even call it the mobilization theme, because whenever you saw mankind mobilizing to take action to stop Godzilla, or prepare for Godzilla, or defend against Godzilla, you would hear this melody. So, which is very fitting, because it has a dramatic sense of urgency, a sense of tension and speed and anxiety.
Run for your lives.
It's a relentless motif. It just keeps on building and building, coming and coming, which is even fitting for Godzilla himself when it became his own theme, because like the monster...
Force of nature.
Yeah, because like the monster, it's just going to keep on coming and coming. It's unstoppable.
For the Odo Island sequences, you can really see the Ainu influence of Mr. Ifukube and how he was able to use that opportunity to write the music that really reflected the spirit and the culture of the Ainu people that he grew up with and became really fond of. Of course, the best example of this would be the Urujima Temple Festival, when you have all those woodwind instruments, cymbals, and Japanese drums for the dance that the natives are performing to appease their sea god Gojira. And it's a nice different pace compared to everything else. Even though the Ainu music is still influenced throughout the soundtrack, it's definitely apparent in this scene. You could just tell this is a perfect opportunity to flex that muscle and use what he's known and loved all his life.
Another noteworthy theme, even though, and I mentioned before that the main title, in a sense, is the theme for the Japanese military. The Japanese army itself also does have a proper army march, which, ironically, was a true Japanese army march that Ifukube wrote during World War II for the Japanese military. I actually had the honor to see this piece performed for the first time in the West some years ago.
You lucky dog.
Oh, I know. What can I say? And the military march was quite lovely itself, but sprinkled here and there throughout the piece, just very briefly, is the famous melody, da 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 dun dun da dun da 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 dun. And that is taken and expanded on just very briefly in this film. I think altogether that music, it doesn't even make up maybe a full minute's worth of the soundtrack. It would eventually become perhaps Ifukube's most popular army march for the kaiju genre, as it was elaborated on even further, as we'll talk about in episode 6. The actual theme for the monster of Godzilla himself in this film is actually a much darker, brooding, slow, ponderous theme. It's an assertive tenor trombone and piano joined with rolling cymbals, reintroducing the beginning of the phrase from the cue Godzilla comes ashore, and then it's expounded on in Godzilla's Rampage. Both cues you're actually going to hear in the soundtrack. And
It's quite chilling.
It is very chilling, and it's one of my absolute favorite pieces of music in the Godzilla franchise.
Same here.
Like the main title, it has a very simple melody. Dun, 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 dun. And it's incredibly powerful. It invokes the awe-inspiring, raw animal bombast of this creature and its unstoppable prowess.
It's a very dark, ponderous, and almost godlike aspect of Godzilla.
So that's two of the three main melodies that Ifukube said he always writes for monster movies. The theme for the monster and a military march. What about the Requiem? Well, do we have a Requiem? In fact, you could argue we have two. One of the most tragic and beautifully haunting melodies in the entire series, in my opinion, is taken from the cue Tragic Sight at the Capitol and Godzilla on the Ocean Floor. Both utilize the same melody. In the film, after Godzilla is driven back off into the sea, the next morning we see Tokyo absolutely devastated.
It looks straight from Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It just looks straight out of that.
Yeah, it looks
a
like
nuclear holocaust.
Buildings are smashed and destroyed. You see the smoldering fires and smoke ascending into the sky. Absolute devastation. Camera pans over to a hospital, and we see nurses and doctors pulling victims on stretchers into the building. And then inside the hospital, we see a heart-wrenching scene of triage, where a doctor is taking a Geiger counter to patients and deciding who is and is not worth saving because of the enormous amounts of radiation poisoning that everybody has received from the monster. And in one scene, the doctor is testing a child that could not be more than 4 or 5 years old and shakes his head sorrowfully to his assistant, indicating for them to just strike it off of a clipboard because there's no hope for this kid. And that assistant was later seen swaddling a screaming baby as its dead, bloodied mother is taken away from the hospital. And you hear this sorrowful, slow lament. And the music is just absolutely heart-wrenching. The same piece of music is later used when our two heroes of the film, Ogata, played by Akira Takarada, the Cary Grant of Japan, and Dr. Serizawa, played by Akihito Hirata, and the two men descend to the bottom of Tokyo Bay to detonate a super weapon that Serizawa had invented and destroy Godzilla with it. And Ifukube colors the mood with throbbing viola, cello, and violins, augmented with a background bass clarinet. The music's insistent, gently rising and falling cadence suggests underwater currents as well as past, present, and future tragedies. But it also suggests something more. A guarded optimism, a daunting heroic task, and an uncertain outcome. And I like that because the closing scene of the movie is very much one of sacrifice.
It is. A life for a life.
Yes. The monster must be vanquished, the dragon must be slayed, but the knight in shining armor isn't going to be riding back on his white horse with the damsel. In this case, the knight in shining armor doesn't return at all. And it's tragic because, and spoiler alerts for anyone who hasn't seen the movie, apologies. And by the way, you're going to get spoilers for every movie in every episode.
Yeah, we're going to discuss it in depth.
Dr. Serizawa sacrifices his own life so that the secret of the super weapon, the oxygen destroyer, cannot be tortured out of him later, and that be used as another weapon added on to the arms race of the Cold War, atomic bomb against atomic bomb, oxygen destroyer against oxygen destroyer.
That was a very realistic take on that because, yes, if someone created a weapon like that, of course they'd want to know how they did it and, torture them to get the information out of them. So he thought about that. He knew that was going to happen after he was going to kill Godzilla.
And speaking of the oxygen destroyer, Ifukube was rather clever in how to make very unnerving nails on a chalkboard sounds. You've seen the movie Psycho, Jonathan?
Oh, absolutely, of course.
Can you guess what scene I'm going to talk about?
The infamous shower scene.
Yeah. What did Bernard Herrmann do with that?
It was interesting. What he did was with the violin screeches that each time that spoiler alert for another movie.
Yeah, spoiler alert
Norman
for another
Bates.
60-year-old movie.
Yes. Anyways, each time that he would go strike Marion Crane, the victim, it mimicked the movement of the knife in and out, in and out. So you had the famous ding, 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 violin screech.
You would have high tension strikes, very hard hitting strokes on the violin, creating that famous unnerving sound effect like you're being stabbed by the music. And that was very inventive and very clever, and it went down in film history as being one of the most significant moments in movie scores, and Ifukube did it first.
I was going to say.
The oxygen destroyer, rather than...
It's more rapid, isn't it?
Oh, it's a more rapid, screeching trill, suggesting the effect that the oxygen destroyer has, eating away at the flesh of its victims, dissolving the bones, and disintegrating all the organic remains of any creature under the water.
And it's very extreme. It goes a very high screeching pitch and then ends with the piano and just a silence, and just as it just disappears. It's very apparent, and then it just disappears out of nowhere.
That's not the only abrasive piece of music.
Oh, give me more abrasion.
In the Q Deadly broadcast, we see several photographers and news reporters documenting Godzilla's rampage across Tokyo from a television tower, but the lights of their flash bulbs not only draw Godzilla's attention, but they aggravate him, and so he brings them to their untimely demise. But in that
they
scene...
saw flashing lights with that.
Your puns are really starting to be abrasive.
Great on you.
Yeah. So, as the popping of the flashbulbs compels the creature to destroy the tower and the poor souls on it, short notes strummed on a viola are joined with raspy trumpets blaring out 4 sharp notes followed by a sustained fifth as the pianoforte pounds away. There is no discernible melody here. It's just raw, unrelenting terror and death. It's just like a dun, 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 dun. And it just repeats like that. And this is an example where Ifukube never intended for this music to be a standalone experience, but to be experienced with the visuals. That brings us to the last major cue of this soundtrack, one which, Jonathan,
oh goodness,
I think that you have been dying to talk about yourself.
Oh, I'm salivating as we speak.
Oh, please don't. It gets the microphone all filthy. So this Requiem, Ifukube actually conducted it live using 200 high school girls. And you can watch the performance that he conducted in the film itself. And though you never see Ifukube conducting the music, he's behind the cameras doing it. I'm actually right now looking at a picture of him conducting all these schoolgirls. There's got to be more than 200. Geez, it looks like there might be 500 there, maybe more.
Yeah, it's a very moving piece. It's very haunting as well. In that scene where Serizawa's watching from the TV, conflicted with his decision, and how it reflects the sorrowness, and that's one thing that makes Gojira very different from other monster films, I feel, is that monster films just look at the destruction, the cause, but never really the effect, at least of the human lives. With Gojira, especially with this piece, it reflects the sorrowness and the tragedy of what has happened. And it really takes its time for you to look at the suffering that's happened, the effect of it. There's the cause and the effect. And so Akira really made an impactful piece with this. just using schoolgirls singing, but it created such an impact, and it really swells your heart, especially knowing how this film was inspired by Hiroshima and Nagasaki and is very much a reflection or a mirror of that. So it's one of my personal favorite pieces and is perfect as a requiem as well.
It is. And I like what you mentioned, because most monster movies will focus on destruction just for the spectacle of the thing, or on the action just for the adrenaline rush, whereas in Godzilla, the destruction, the action is something to be dreaded. It's sometimes even uncomfortable to watch. Like when you see Godzilla destroying cities and setting buildings on fire, and then in between those buildings you have a middle-aged mother cuddling her two very young children and telling them, "Don't be afraid, we'll be with Father in heaven very soon." You don't get any points for guessing what that might be referencing. The human suffering aspect of this is very poignant in this movie. Often Gojira feels more like a Holocaust film, or shows scenes of suffering that you would expect from a war movie or something akin to Schindler's List, rather than a monster on the loose film.
All right, it's very real. I mean, it harkens back to that time of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So it's drenched in reality, even though it is fiction. Yes, there's no radioactive dinosaur rampaging through Japan in real life, but it is drenched in reality and in metaphor of what did happen, though.
Yeah,
so that's what makes it really impactful.
It's drenched in real human emotions that had been experienced in similar situations.
Exactly.
Now, and that Requiem was actually reprised at the end of the film as well, which is not exactly the kind of ending you would expect for a movie of this sort to end on.
It's not happy. It's not a victorious, trumpet blaring at the end with end credits like a lot of monster movies. No, it's very bittersweet. It's very, it really gives you the sensation that, yes, the main conflict is resolved. Gojira is gone, but at what cost?
Yeah, we still have pieces.
Still damage. Yeah,
we still have to pick up the pieces and get our lives back together.
Yes, exactly how it was after the events of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. They have to rebuild as a nation at this point. There's so many lives that have been lost, and it's going to take them quite a while to return to their normal selves, and it's never going to be normal after that.
And not only that, but the film also ends on an ominous note. Even though the monster has been vanquished, and now we've lost one of our main heroes, and everybody is depressed, and that's just it. It's like when the announcement goes that Godzilla is dead, the whole ship full of people doesn't then burst into applause and cheering and hats flying in the air and graffiti. Everybody takes their hats off, lowers their head in a moment of silence, and prayerfully reflects on the sacrifice that had just been made, and ends on this tragic musical note. And Dr. Yamane, the paleontologist who assisted in the discovery, who helped in discovering Godzilla, laments at the end of the film that because Godzilla was made by atomic bombs, if mankind continues to test nuclear weapons, who's to say another Godzilla might not appear somewhere in the world? Now,
foreshadowing.
Yeah, foreshadowing. Now that may sound like a cheap excuse to allow for sequels, but honestly no sequels had been planned at this point. It was seen to be, this movie was made to be a standalone experience. Yeah. That
not at the time, yeah.
Yeah. Eventually it did, yes, it retroactively did allow for sequels to be made, and made they were, my gosh.
Oh, many.
However, initially it was meant as a warning that, we played with fire that we had no business trying to control. Mankind's arrogance in dominating nature and in playing God. As one famous lyricist once put it, history shows again and again how nature points out the folly of man.
Yes. And that's going to be a theme that recurs throughout the franchise, perhaps in different forms, but it does appear in different instances throughout the movies.
Now that we've given you some of the background and context of the score of Gojira, we will now present to you what I like to call a symphony in miniature. So we have taken the entire score of Godzilla and we have condensed it down to its essential elements. If you've never had an opportunity to listen to the soundtracks of these films before, this is a wonderful substitute. The musical suites that will conclude each podcast episode is a sufficient stand-in for the entire soundtrack of the movie. If you've heard our suites that we've put together, you have as good as heard the soundtrack from the movie for all intents and purposes. So, please sit back, put on your best headphones if you don't already have them on. Make sure that you are free from distraction and disturbance. Turn off the lights and enjoy what many film historians and filmmakers, including John Carpenter, have called one of the greatest film soundtracks ever recorded in history. And we will see you afterward for a quick goodbye.
Sit back and enjoy the ride, folks.
Well, need another tissue, Jonathan?
I'm gonna need a few.
That, my friends, was Akira Ifukube's score for Gojira.
And what a score it was.
I hope that you enjoyed it, but I also hope that perhaps you've been able to listen to it, whether for the first time or not, with a newfound appreciation for what makes this score so unique. It is certainly a minimalist score. In a movie that is over an hour and a half in length, there's only about 30 or 40 minutes of music in the entire film. This is the granddaddy of all Godzilla scores. Ifukube sets the tone, the template for everything to come next. Now, that doesn't mean that the Godzilla scores that will come rarely stray from this sound or this style of music. Far from it. In fact, just give us 9 or 10 episodes and you'll be in for a shock.
Yes, there's definitely going to be a difference throughout the other soundtracks, which really shows the range and the different styles that the Godzilla movies throughout the years took and put into their music, and represents that time that it was made, and is somewhat like a time capsule, each movie, depending on what period they were made. So it's going to be a wide range that you guys are going to see as we continue our podcast.
Yes, just as you could hear the dark, brooding personality of Godzilla in this film through his motif, you will be able to follow the evolution of the character of this monster through his music from film to film. As you listen to the soundtrack, you will be able to distinctly tell what time period are we in and what is the character and personality of Godzilla. We release an episode every week. Tune in next week for episode 2, in which we tackle the very rushed sequel, Godzilla Raids Again! Or
Gigantus the Fire Monster.
No, we don't call it Gigantus the Fire Monster. Behave yourself, Jonathan. We have a sense of propriety. And we will be introduced to a brand new composer, Masaru Sato, who is an awesome yin to Ifukube's yang. So, thank you for joining us. We hope you had a wonderful time.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Evan. And this has been G-Score, the podcast. We'll see you next week. And remember, kids, don't pick up a radioactive trilobite with your bare hands.